Hello, everyone. My name is Rebecca. My pronouns are she, her, and I am one of the co-directors of the Notebooks Collective. Founded in 2021, we are a virtual literary art space focused on community, connection, and continued learning. Please check our website at thenotebookscollective.com to see upcoming events and classes. The Notebooks Collective believes that Black Lives Matter and acknowledges that as a virtual organization, our offices are on the lands of the Kickapoo, Nipmuc, Agawam, Massachusetts, and Pawtucket tribes. Native peoples across the world continue to preserve and celebrate their cultures, and we encourage you to support Native writers and artists. And as we do this land acknowledgement, we want to recognize those who are suffering from conquest and terror and colonialism in Gaza, Ukraine, Congo, and Sudan. Our thoughts are with these people. We know these are stressful times, uncertain times, and we are glad you've joined us tonight to be in community with each other. I now welcome Lisa to introduce our presenters.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lisa. My pronouns are she, her, and I am one of the co-directors of the Notebooks Collective. Let me minimize my screen. I get to introduce our presenters tonight. Good, bad, virtuous, monstrous, lyrical, fierce, stunning, confessional, honest, precise. I could keep listing words that in some way apply to both Eugenia Leigh's Bianca and Diannely Antigua's Good Monster, but somehow I can't piece them together in a way that does either collection justice. Piece together, now that I think about it, that might be an entry point to start talking about these collections. Each pieces together an unflinching look at a life riddled with trauma, pain, pleasure, epiphany, and acceptance. More than that, though, each uses craft as a form of piecing. In Good Monster, Diannely uses, through her series of diary entry poems that are collages written with lines collected from 36 and counting personal journals that she has kept since age 9. And Eugenia, by using the Japanese Zuihitsu form, a series of loosely connected essays and fragments for the poem Bianca too, and also by including an essay, yes, prose, in the middle of the collection. There's more, of course, to think about either of these collections. These poets can be summarized in an introduction is silly at best, but that's better done by them than me, and this is their time, not ours. So I'm going to share their official bios and then turn the screen over to them. Eugenia Leigh is a Korean-American poet and the author of 2 poetry collections, Bianca from 4-Way Books 2023 and Blood, Sparrows and Sparrows, 4-Way Books 2014, winner of the Late Night Library's 2015 Debut-litzer Prize in Poetry, selected by Arisa White, as well as a finalist for both the National Poetry Series and the Yale Series of Younger Poets. Poems from Bianca received the Bess Hokin Prize from Poetry Magazine and have appeared in numerous publications, including the Academy of American Poets Poem a Day, The Nation, Ploughshares, Waxwing, and the Best of the Net anthology. Her essays have appeared in Time, The Rumpus, and elsewhere. Eugenia received her MFA from Sarah Lawrence College and serves as a poetry editor at the Adroit Journal and is the Valentines Editor at Honey Literary, a BIPOC-focused literary journal and literary arts organization. Diannely Antigua is a Dominican-American poet and educator born and raised in Massachusetts. Her debut collection, Ugly Music, from Yes Yes Books 2019, was the winner of the Pampit River Prize and a 2020 Whiting Award. Her second poetry collection, Good Monster, is forthcoming with Copper Canyon Press in 2024. She received her BA in English from the University of Massachusetts Lowell, where she won the Jack Kerouac Creative Writing Scholarship, and received her MFA at NYU, where she was awarded a Global Research Initiative Fellowship to Florence, Italy. She is the recipient of additional fellowships from Canto Mundo, Community of Writers, Fine Arts Work Center Summer Program and was a finalist for the 2021 Ruth Lilly and Dorothy Sargent Rosenberg Poetry Fellowship. Her work has been nominated for the Pushcart Prize and chosen for the Best of the Net anthology. Her poems can be found in Poem a Day, Poetry, the American Poetry Review, Washington Square Review, the Adroit Journal, and elsewhere. She currently teaches in the MFA writing program at the University of New Hampshire as the inaugural Nasrat Yassini Poet in Residence. She hosts the podcast Bread and Poetry and is currently the Poet Laureate of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, the youngest and first person of color to receive the title. In 2023, she was awarded an Academy of American Poets Laureate Fellowship to launch the Bread and Poetry Project. We want to welcome both of these incredible poets to the Notebooks Collective they're going to begin by reading, and then they will have some conversation, and then we will have time for questions. It would be great if you would drop those questions in private chats to either Becca or myself. We will make sure that those get asked, and then we will follow up with just some poems at the end. So I will turn it over to both of you now. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having us, Lisa and Becca. And it's such a joy to be here with you, Diannely. And your book is out now, right? I think the bio said forthcoming, but I have it.
Yeah, it is out now. Yeah, it came out in May. I think that was an older bio. I'm also like not the poet laureate of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. That ended in May as well. But I like to say I'm poet laureate emeritus, so that still counts.
Amazing. And we were going to start with poems. Maybe I'll go first, and then you can go and read from your new book, which I'm so excited to hear you read from. I'll read just two poems. The first poem I thought about reading, it's actually from my first book. And I thought about reading it because right before this conversation, I was rereading both of Diannely's beautiful books. I have them both right here. I promise, I know like I made you go get your first book. I promise I'll ask you more questions about Good Monster. But there was a line in Ugly Music that I don't think I'd noticed before, and it was from diary entry number 4. And the line said, I thought about suicide, then my algebra homework. And by the way, for anybody who's here, just probably gonna be like all the trigger warnings, like probably gonna talk about death and suicide and mental illness and all the happy stuff. So just brace yourself and please feel free to step out if you need to. So the line was, I thought about suicide, then my algebra homework. And when I read that just recently, I was like, I have a poem in my first book also where the young self thinks about suicide and then thinks about math. And I was like, that is such a specific experience. So anyways, I'm gonna read that poem for you. It's called Every Hair on Your Head. And it begins with an epigraph from a band called Sparkle Horse. And the singer behind that band, Mark Linkus, he died by suicide. And this song is called Hundreds of Sparrows. And the lyric goes, every hair on your head is counted. You are worth hundreds of sparrows. The day you pushed a bullet through your heart, the length of a day on Earth shortened by a millionth of a second. That same day, a NASA satellite captured an image of a dust storm. Chile withstood its 130th aftershock in a week, and I glimpsed a bird twitching on the floor of a Brooklyn subway station. Its eyeballs bulged as if to literally absorb the ocular world, and I shuddered away. For hours, I saw that flinching creature in my mind. I saw hundreds of similar birds shimmering into the station to lie next to it, a quilt of silvery bodies tiled wing to wing. On good days, I want to be saved. Most days, I want every savior in our hell, so they'll know torment in the bloodstream, death's whistling, ceaseless, blurring the cleanest heartbeats. My first time, I was 13. I tested 5 pills. My stomach barely ached. I ate ramen, lived, solved math problems. But for days before that, I envisioned my body smeared, inside out, a swarthy, dazzling canvas. What I wouldn't give to graze that silence. Did you do it standing up or crouching? Which was the bigger surprise, the gun punching or the angel catching you? And then I will read just one poem from my book, Bianca. So both books, in case you don't know, for the people who are here, handle my family history of childhood abuse, domestic violence, parental incarceration. My father was in prison the entire time I was a teenager, and parental deportation. He was eventually deported to South Korea, a country he hadn't been to since he was 10 years old, as a way out of prison. But there were 9 years between these books, and during that time, there was a lot of life lived. I got married. I had 2 miscarriages. I had my son. And I also finally got the privilege of getting mental health help in my 30s. And when I was 33, I was diagnosed with complex PTSD and bipolar 2 disorder. But before that, I still had bipolar 2 disorder, but I didn't have the language or the vocabulary for this. But I was still sort of, a nightmare sometimes. And so my friends gave this nightmare version of me a name, and they called her Bianca. Because I was, in the daytime, I had to go to work, I had to go to school, I was more high functioning. And, so I would, get blackout drunk, wreak havoc. And then the next morning, my friends would be like, so Bianca was here. And I'd be like, oh shit, what did Bianca do? So the next poem I wanted to read because during those 9 years, it's similar to Diannely. Like, I've kept a lot of journals, and Bianca specifically was writing a lot of, entries kind of as a way to cope before therapy existed for me. And during that time, as I was going through these journal entries, I found a letter that my Bianca self had written to my future self. So I decided to write a letter back to her. So this is called To the Self Who, 12 years ago, wrote a letter to me. Soon you'll drive from ocean to ocean to reboot yourself and see how deft you are at saving your life. Here I am nesting on the other side. You write to me from your 19th flight in a manic year, all Cuervo and Moxie, no address. You'd rather die, you say, than wind up like me, serving the best scoops of my prime to a man who chooses vanilla. You wouldn't like my desk, 2 feet wide and screwed to a wall, or this blue crib monitor ticking like a bomb waiting for the baby to go off. Your fears still crackle in the corners of my better brain, a brain I've learned to water and give access to sunlight. I remember the racket of plates hurled in those homes that were not homes, and I hate how I still hammer everything good until it matches the ugly warp of my wounds. I hold my husband like I am afraid I will detonate him. Like you, I know love is not a thing to be earned, only given, only lost. Like you, I forget this. We are not anyone wanted, but we were born anyway. Don't forget this. After my wedding, I wept like a Kishin, like a white-gowned, wire-haired ghost from a Korean horror story for 2 blurred years. I thought I'd fooled him into marrying me. A month before he proposed, his entire family, including the children, gathered around a cake with my name on it and sang a song with my name in it to celebrate the fact of my birth. I couldn't take it, how easy it was for them to be a family. Love should be more mysterious than this. How else can I explain the decades lived without it? I've seen you pray to a God you don't believe in. It's all right. Your mouth is not the wrong mouth to ask for this. You question, who would take your body? Who would take your blood? Eat, drink, in remembrance of you. Let us keep the feast.
That was so good. Awesome to hear you read. And we were chatting a little bit before the event started, but Eugenia and I, we have done several events together, several panels at AWP, and we have actually never had a conversation other than like, oh, hello, hi, goodbye, you're great, you're amazing. So this is really the first time that we're being like able to sit down. So this is our first date, and you are all witness to it. You're welcome. Um, I really want to read that poem that you referenced from my first book, Ugly Music. This is my current copy. The first copy I ever had, and it's all beat up. So well loved. Um, all right, so it is diary entry number 4. And I had it and then I lost it. 1 second. And Lisa made mention of this when she did it in her intro, but all of my diary entry poems are written using my old journals that I've been writing in since I was 9 years old, and each of them corresponds with the number of the journal because I'm a Virgo and I number everything. So this was from the 4th diary, and I just write collage poems using those journals. So it's a lot of fun to kind of give myself the opportunity to play with language, even though I'm writing about some very traumatic, difficult things. And then sometimes I like to add another constraint to it and make it a sestina, or in this case, it's a hustle. So diary entry number 4, hustle. Then I did something I didn't think I could do. Dear God, I thought about suicide, then my algebra homework, then maybe something else godly, how I was going to fast and pray for a language to explain last Wednesday. I'm no God, but I'm trying to dust off the ashes of the change. I got my period, and I feel less godlike, an unclean romance in my body, how I cupped my hands to catch whatever came. Little bit of God's blood escaping my vagina, or how the idea of cutting a wrist might lead to more goddess. Dr. Rosenblum says, I need a counselor, says, I am officially broken, that I will pick up a knife to cut the God spell out of me. I tell him there's a mouth in my underwear, wadded with tissue. It sings beautiful things when it's touched. It sings, oh God. Brady. So I feel like I haven't read from my first book in a while. So it's like really refreshing to like go back. I don't know if that's similar to, when you do that, Eugenia. But I've been reading from my second book so much, I'm like sick of it. So it's nice to read from the first one and be like, this is when I fell in love with poems and look what they could do. So this next one I'm going to read is from my book, Good Monster. And just to explain a little bit about the monster in hopes that it will help, later on in conversation for folks. Similar to Eugenia's Bianca, I have what I call my monster. I do this particular type of therapy called internal family systems, or IFS, and it's parts work where you name the parts of yourselves as a way to get to know them a little better. And my anxiety, depression, and boundless need, they're neighbors, and they like to hang out, and yeah, when one of them's going off, the other one, they call the other one up, and then they all like get together and throw a party. And that collectively is called my monster. And I think for so many years, I, villainized this monster and hated just like the havoc that this monster was wreaking in my life, failed relationships, um, you know, self-harm, not being able to keep a job, all of these different things that um, made me hate the monster. And it wasn't until I started to love the monster and listen to the monster, really. Um, that was when this monster started to like relinquish control um, and started to kind of like loosen her grip on my life. So what I wanted to do was to write a love letter to her, and I felt like this book, Good Monster, could be that. For so many years of being villainized, but also trapped in this relentlessly horrible role. I wanted to honor her. So Good Monster is my book for her. I wanted to read the first poem that opens the book. And I didn't write it thinking about that it would be in the voice of the monster. But when I was putting the book together, I thought, this is the monster speaking. Um, and it's called Someday I'll Stop Killing Diannely Antigua. This isn't an apology, but rather a confession. I loved your body before I was born. I counted your future fingers and toes and touched your hands before they ever touched another's, my left and your right, and we slept in the womb that exists before wombs, mouth pressed over mouth, a position I'd learn to crave. I loved your body before I was born and hated your body after my first gasp of rusted air, after hearing your shriek match my own. Perhaps I hated your body because of what you could do to another body. Opened it, not a wound, but a portal. And the permission you took, I then took. 16 years waiting, took a steak knife to your wrists, drew striped doors and the red, entered the room. Once I opened all the pill bottles, left them on the dresser, watched you, 1, 2, 3 pills at a time, swallow them in front of the mirror. Reflection slipping into bed after, into the little trap I'd set. Only 20 minutes had passed when they found you, strapped your arms to the gurney, and I hid under the sheets where I'd held you moments before, told you the story of Little Red Riding Hood as you closed your eyes. I'd like to say I stopped there. A year later, I tried it again. Ritual of pills and mirror and bed, and now the story of the brown babies, all lost before they were lost. And you wept as I held you once more, understood this was my task all along, to kill. And what a love to give into my violence. Your breath weaker, diaphragm lulled to sleep. How could I not pity you, dear one? How could I not wipe the spittle from your lips? Dial 3 numbers. They saved you again. And you didn't blame me when asked. Called your assassin a name you read once in a book about death. And I thanked you in time. And in time, I hope to stop trying. Or in time, I imagine you'll grow strong, grab me by the throat, close a portal, perhaps, and I'll forgive you. Thank you.
Amazing.
Oh, I don't often read that poem, and now I know why.
It's beautiful. I loved hearing it in your voice.
Thank you. Thank you. And when I was rereading your book, I was noticing that you have a poem that kind of touches on that. It's my whole life I was trained to deny myself. And there's a line that says, um, uh, I carried them one by one, like bride after bride, across the threshold and removed their boots. I drew baths loaded with salts, cooked meals, and butter. I let each one sleep when she needed to sleep, and in time, I thanked them. I came to recognize their service, and in time, they let me love them the way a father or a mother ought to have loved them. Them. Yes, I suppose I do mean me.
Oh my God, can you read all my poems?
Yes.
Whenever I have a reading, I'm gonna be like, Tina, read them, please. That was beautiful.
But I was reading, so I was rereading your book over the past few days, and when I got to that poem, I'm like, did I just plagiarize her? Did I did I copy this? And I was like, no, I had never seen this poem when I wrote my poem. But it's funny to think that we, in a poem written about similar things, Bianca and the monster, that even the same construction of language and in time will do this and time will do that. And it was just so like eerily, wonderfully, beautifully similar that I had to mention it. And I'm thinking about how our books, I think, really talk to one another. And for some folks who don't know, Bianca generously blurbed Good Monster. So if you buy the book, you can read her lovely blurb on the back of the book. Um, but I was even curious too, like one thing I've always wanted to ask you, like, what was your experience like reading my book and what similarities did you find as you were kind of like going through? And how do you feel like maybe some of like our work talks to one another? However you want to answer that.
Yeah, it's so funny you brought up that poem, because I thought of that poem while reading your book too, and because that's my parts work poem. And I also practice internal family systems from time to time. I also have my many parts, and I really think that that helped to bring that poem about. But I actually thought of that poem as I was reading your last poem in Good Monster, I Buy My Monster Roses,
Mhm.
because I feel like both of them appear toward the ends of our books. And there's a moment where, one of our parts, maybe the higher self or, the present day part is tending to
Mhm.
to Bianca and to the monster. And that's what parts work ultimately is really about, right? We're revisit these parts are always with us. Some of them get big and loud, and the practice is to speak back to these younger parts or these other parts and to give them their space, but also bring them into the present and remind them, we're our 2024 selves now. We don't need you to get loud and wild anymore. And I just felt like I Buy My Monster Roses, um, which is, as it sounds for the people who maybe haven't read it yet, was such a beautiful way to kind of acknowledge like the monster is always there, but I am tending to her and tending to, or for you, I love that the idea is that the monster is like all of those parts kind of congregating, creating this like beast, which is fantastic. But yeah, I really, it's interesting because reading your work was one thing, but then reading your books, thinking about how we're going to have a conversation together was so eerie because it really felt like we had written these books like sitting at a kitchen table writing together. I was like, I don't know if I can think of another poet whose books I feel like are so connected. Like our Venn diagram is so I'm like losing my language. I don't know, like it's so shared. No, that's not the right word. But like the center of the Venn diagram is like rich with a lot. I'm like, I could talk to you about so many things. And sorry, now my brain is going in like all these other ways because I was like, and then you said you're a Virgo. I'm a Leo Virgo cusp. And I had many questions about the numbering. and like how you revisited. But I can get to that later too, or maybe I'll just ask it now. I'll ask it now since it's coming to me. Which is that, I love that you have your diary entry poems. I didn't realize that the numbers referred to the journals that they came from, because you said you
Yeah.
have like 30 some odd. Is that right?
Yeah, I think now I'm on journal number 39. At this
Wow.
point. Yeah. And like the journals have evolved over time. I mean, like my first journal was very much like, Dear Diary, this is what happened today. I love AJ McLean from the Backstreet Boys.
That
And
was
also
my favorite Backstreet Boy.
because he was the bad boy in and out of rehab, of course. And like made so much sense why I would like him. Um, and it was very much like that. And then it got a lot more serious as I started to, become a teenager and was coming to terms with a lot of the domestic violence and abuse I experienced in my early childhood. And then another thing that you and I have in common is um, religion and Bible and Christianity and how that kind of overlaps. And I was raised, I'd say in a cult, a very cultic environment. And a lot of things I wasn't allowed to talk about, especially mental illness. So my diaries became very much a safe haven for me during that time. And I was in that system for about 10 years, a good decade. And those were the formative years too, when you're just kind of like coming into your own and realizing who you are as a person. And, everything about my identity was just kind of stripped from me. My individuality was just, I wasn't allowed to really access that, what I could wear, to who I could see, what I could listen to or watch on TV, all of those things were controlled. Um, so I really only had my journals, and they were the only place that I could have, an uncensored type of conversation. And I just so happened to be having that conversation with myself. And it's just interesting to see how they've evolved. And as I've gotten older, the journals have become just like a kind of catch-all for anything. It could be grocery lists, but most importantly, it's therapy notes. I am just so passionate about working on myself and healing, and it is indeed work and it's serious. So if I'm in a session and I feel like I've come to a point where um I've reached some type of like epiphany, like I need to write it down because I'm going to forget. So a lot of the times my journals have been used for that purpose, and the majority of them now at this point are therapy notes, but it's evolved over time. And um the numbering system really is, it's more for me, I think, than the reader, because I can look at, let's say, diary entry number 4 that I read, and I can be like, oh, I remember what was going on in that
Mhm.
particular journal. The 4th one, oh, that was when I kept talking about hoping God would send me a righteous husband, and was God, 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 God. So I'm like, oh yeah, a hustle would be great for that because you have to repeat the
Mm.
word. So it just made sense. So it's interesting how the journals let me know kind of the form they want to be in
Mm.
when I then write a diary entry poem. I've written sestinas and pantoums. I love a good diary entry like slash pantoum. Like that's probably my favorite. Um, but I feel like the journals let me know what they end up wanting to be, and I just gotta listen to it. But tell me about like your relationship to like journal writing, and has that affected, how has, I guess, that affected your poetry?
Yeah. Also, I grew up in a very similarly like oppressive Christian environment. My dad, who was abusive, was also a youth pastor, and he was in seminary when he met my mom, and
Mm.
she went to a Christian college and got pregnant with me her freshman year and dropped out in order to like marry my dad. And then we were raised as like ministers' daughters who, like there would be abuse like on Sunday morning, and then we go to church and like no one knew anything. My whole childhood, we kept everything secret until I was in college. And it was actually, I was like a very gung-ho involved in like Christian ministry in college. And it was there though that I met the first group of people that I could be open with about my childhood and my background, like the first time I had friends who told me about like the abuse that they'd experienced, and the first time I really practiced saying these things out loud. But throughout that time, yes, like journal writing was kind of the thing that I think was the one place where I could tell the truth, where it was the one place where, my mom would always be like, it's okay to be angry at God. And my journals are all like, fuck you, God. Like, well, and just, the only time that they actually, like, I let those voices appear is in that one long Zuihitsu in Bianca, was the first time that I actually went through and thought, okay, maybe I can let some of these lines from these journal entries breathe and take form and have life in a poem. It felt safe to kind of do that in one big piece. I think that when I was younger, I tried to do what you actually succeeded to do beautifully, which is, take these journal entries and think about them as poems, or like, help them to evolve into poems, or find poems based on them. But like, they were just always, I could never figure out that path from taking the trauma and making it into art. Like when I saw the journal entry, I was like, that's exactly what it feels like. I don't know how to say it any better. And it's just, I didn't know quite how to do that. But what I think is so fascinating is that, the numbering is obviously not chronological, because you find poems from multiple journal entries. And then in Good Monster, sometimes you have more diary entry poems, and some of them come from older diary entries too. I guess I was really wondering, because both of these books, even though they take from some of the same material, they're totally distinct books. They're I feel like the emotional impulse behind them is very different. And Good Monster is I think, especially with like the sad girl sonnets, punctuating the collection, I feel like it felt really, really in conversation with Bianca and talking a lot about mental illness. And I guess I was wondering, when you were writing your first book, did you know that Good Monster would exist in the way that it did? Like, did you know you were going to use those diary entries again, or continue the series? And I'm also curious about how the sad girl sonnets came into play, and like the numbering for that too, like how that evolved.
Yeah. So a little bit about like the diary entry form and how they started. I started writing them when I was a student at NYU. I took a class with Matthew Rohrer, and it was based on making it new. And we talked about the centos form, and the assignment was to write a centos, and using books from our bookshelf. And I was like, well, I'm like, I feel like so weird, like appropriating other people's language, even though that's like the assignment. I'm like, why don't I do it with my own? I'm like, those are also books that are on my shelf, my journals. So I did that instead. And I wrote a, centos, using my own, poetry. And, it's just a collage poems are using my own journals. So, and I just continued with the project even after that one assignment, because there really was like an endless supply of language to be used. And the poems could change based off like what I ended up collecting from the journals. And I've even done this thing where I've written what I call sister poems. The book Ugly Music has several sister poems. So diary entry number 4, there's actually 2 diary entry number 4s. There's the Hustle.
The Virgo.
There's the Hustle, and then there's the Atonement. And what I did was, after I wrote my first poem using that language I had collected, I wrote an entirely new poem using that same language that I had collected. So off that page that I had written down, sentences and lines that like really spoke out to me, I ended up just using that material again to make something distinct. And it was just kind of fun again to like play with language and see what would happen. And I've done that several times, throughout this whole like diary entry series journey. And it's been really interesting to see how like the images transform from poem to poem, or things are reinforced. But even though the language is similar, they do feel like very different poems, which I've always thought was really cool. And so I have, just continued to do that since, Ugly Music came out. And I had no idea that Good Monster would exist as a second book. I had no idea that Ugly Music would even be a book. That's a whole nother story. We can get into that. But yeah, I wasn't really thinking about publication at all. I was just continuing to write poems, and the diary entry happened to be one of those. But also, so were the Sad Girl sonnets that I wrote during my thesis semester. Actually, um, I was I was in Florence for 3 months, and I had recently been heartbroken. I had broken up with. And isn't that the best time to write poems, is when you're
Yeah, the Italy poems are beautiful.
And I was like, well, my thesis is done, which happened to be Ugly Music at the time. And I was like, let me just like embark on something like new, just to keep myself like occupied, something that I'll have fun with. I was like, okay, well, let me just write a ton of sonnets. And like they'll just be kind of like American sonnets. I don't have to worry about like, rhyme scheme or meter or anything like that. I'm just gonna enjoy them. So I ended up writing 25 sad girl sonnets while I was in Florence, Italy. And the numbering literally has only to do with the order that they were written in and nothing more. Though I do feel like, Sad Girl Sonnet number 1 really introduces the whole premise. The first line is, even in the most beautiful city, you can still be sad as fuck. And which is very true. Even in Florence, which is probably one of the most beautiful cities I've ever lived in, I was supremely, supremely sad. But I wanted the sad girl sonnets to kind of be like episodic throughout Good Monster and feel kind of like almost like a commercial break between like all of the other poems. I still wanted them to kind of like be informative in the greater narrative of the book, but to also feel like it was a separate narrative too. Because like you could read all of the sad girl sonnets and not read anything else in the book and still understand that narrative. And then same with I feel like you could probably take the sad girl sonnets out and read the book and still feel like you've gotten the narrative. But then together, it's just interesting to see how those narratives just are interwoven. And unlike the diary entry poems, the sad girl sonnets, I've kind of let them live in their time period because they're very like specific to that era in my life, while the diary entry poems, those kind of just continue. Sorry, there's noise. But yeah, so the diary entry poems will continue in the future, and like I'm still writing them to this day. So that's kind of just ongoing right now. Yeah.
I have so many questions I want to ask you, but I think the thing that came to mind as you were talking about your sad girl sonnets is, I think that's amazing and impressive that you took this time when you were heartbroken and was like, I'm going to launch myself into this project and just focus on writing these sonnets. I think I'm always amazed when poets, especially poets struggling with like chronic illness or mental illness, or just regular life things, are able to write poems. Like I forget how I'm able to do that sometimes, because I think so much about the times I'm not able to do it. And I guess I'm wondering, what are some like mental hurdles that you feel like you have to get past in order to be able to be productive at all in our terrible capitalistic society? And like, what are some practices you have, or just, I don't know, like, what do you struggle with? Like, how do you do what you do, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah. I mean, after I answer, I would love to know what you do. But yeah, the hurdles, they are many. I mean, I have MDD, CPTSD, general anxiety disorder, OCD, all of the things. And I also suffer from chronic pain. I was diagnosed with fibromyalgia when I was in my early 20s. So I'm dealing with a lot of like brain fog and a lot of things that prohibit me from getting to the page. Because I can't really go foggy to the page. That doesn't work. So I really just have to be kind with myself and understand that there are certain moments in my life that are for gathering, and then there are certain moments in my life that are for, like the feast, for producing the feast, as it were. And right now, I feel like I'm in a more gathering stage. I feel like because Good Monster just came out, I haven't really been writing or producing as much. But I think this is a time for me to gather seeds that will later become future poems. And I write them down in my notebooks, I write them down on my phone, and hope that when my mind is less foggy, I can go to the page and make something out of those seeds. Um, and I think that it's just important, for anyone dealing with mental illness to understand that rhythm, that ebb and flow, that it's not going to be. I mean, I've tried to do 30 for 30, for instance. I couldn't do it. It's like, even with like, I don't have a good month, I barely have a good week or day, let alone like a good month. I don't think I can be that productive. So it's just understanding that my schedule when it comes to producing looks a lot different than someone else who maybe is not dealing with mental illness, or who's not, or who's able-bodied. So it's, yeah, I don't know if I can say what it is that I do because it's always changing, but I try to invite uncomplicated joy, like reality TV. It's not my life that's getting messed up, it's someone else's. So I watch other people ruin their
It's
life.
very comforting.
Yes. Like Love is Blind, Perfect Match, whatever. Summer House, that's a really guilty pleasure of mine. And then also things that aren't so, I guess, dramatic, like cooking shows seem to be very helpful with that as well. But I'm curious about like what you do and what hurdles you have to face, Eugenia.
Yeah, I love that idea of having times of gathering, and times of kind of harvesting or feasting. I definitely think of my process similarly in terms of seasons. Like this is a season for reading and learning. I mentioned that there were 9 years between the books, and there was a period of about 3 years during those 9 years when I was barely writing, I wasn't publishing anything. I had just gone deep into like a pretty intense depression. And that was what led me to finally see a psychiatrist, actually. And during that time, I even cut myself off from most of my writing community that I had had. And um, and I really thought like I wouldn't write another poem again. I really thought like, well, that was the one book, and now I've just become this like shell of a person. Um, but now I think I kind of seek out the poets who have seasons like that. I know that Louise Gluck talks a lot, or talked a lot about how in between books she'd often have a period of about like 2 or 3 years when she would not write anything, and she's in interviews saying, and I really mean I didn't write anything. I was just developing my next voice, figuring out what the next thing was. And that brings me so much comfort because she's Louise Gluck, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like poets don't talk often enough about the need to have that cocoon period in order to come out with, what the next voice is or what the next book is. And it's also terrifying because it requires a lot of faith. It requires a lot of getting back to the page after time away. And, no one's waiting there on the other side being like, you need to write another poem. Like it's either you tell yourself to do it or it's never going to happen, which is also terrifying. And so I also, I think I just I operate with a lot of guilt a lot of the times, and I think that's part of like the fucked up Christian upbringing.
Yeah.
Where I'm like, I am not a real poet right now. I am not doing the thing that I'm supposed to be doing. Um, and so I think a lot of times it's just giving myself permission. Like there is no right way to be a poet. There's no right way to be a person. And
Mhm.
that if today's a sad day, that's okay. I think I'm also figuring out my own rhythms. Like I know now that if I have an event like this where like, you know, we're deep diving into our trauma and really reading from our work and talking about it, I know that the next day I'm going to need to take a nap, like a pretty
Oh,
long fucking
yeah.
nap. And just like watch some Top Chef and you know do what I need to do. And now, and in the past, I used to berate myself for it. I'd be like, you dumb bitch. Like Barack Obama didn't watch Top Chef every day. He was working every day. But now I see that that was like a very toxic way to talk to myself. And also, you know, that capitalism sucks. And I've kind of grown out of that kind of thinking and reminding myself that no, my priority right now is to be healthy. And
Right.
unless I'm healthy, I'm not going to be able to write these poems anyways. Like I'm never going to do another event again if I don't let myself rest after each one.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
but in thinking about some of that though, and so this is a question, sorry to like kind of pivot, but something I really was dying to ask you, especially because you also write so openly about a lot of like the religious trauma and I feel like when you grow up in that kind of environment, the God language or the awareness of God or the awareness of like the spiritual realm, just you can't escape it. No matter like the ups and downs of faith or not having faith, whether we've decided like we're Christian again or we're atheist again or whatever, it's always there and completely inescapable. And I think something that I see a lot, especially at Adroit, where we get a lot of young writers coming into the slush pile, and we have a prize for high school and college writers. For a lot of young poets writing about religion or their experience with religion, they use a lot of the same sort of keywords that we hear a lot, like broken.
Mm.
You know, we kind of call ourselves, you know, like unclean, the
Mhm.
same sort of language that we use to label certain behaviors or certain types of people that we were warned about. But what I love in your poems is you take these words and you turn them on their head. And you also do it in the titles of your books, right? Like ugly is another one of those words, and good also is so, there's so much packed into good. Um, and I love the epigraph that you chose for Good Monster. It's a, I guess it's from a Dorothea Lasky poem, and it says, like when he said, I am no good, I am no good. Goodness is not the point anymore. Holding on to things, now that's the point. Um, and I'm so curious about how your relationship to those words, like broken or ugly or good,
Mhm.
have evolved over time and how you have um, pulled yourself out of that kind of like brainwashing and training we had.
Oh, I don't know if I've pulled myself out of it
Yeah,
completely. You know,
right.
it's a work in progress. Uh, but I remember, you know, in my youth words like good and bad being used quite often. And when I was young, I was one of the good ones. I was a very good Christian girl. I was very exemplary. I played flute in the church band. I was a leader of the girls singing group. I made straight A's. We went to a church school and um, I was we had this thing called pastor's honor roll. It was like when you made like 98 average or above. I made like pastor's honor roll like my entire high school career. So yeah, pastor's honor roll, which says another thing. Um, but I was like the pastor's pet in a lot of ways, and not because I wanted to be necessarily, but because I thought like if the pastor's happy with me, then God is happy with me. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I want to be the goodest, Christian girl, absolutely, and I remember in moments where I would do something that was deemed um bad or inappropriate, like when I liked a boy who I wasn't supposed to like. And I held his hand. That was bad, very bad. And I learned then that when you do a bad thing like that, things get taken away. Like I wasn't allowed to sing in church anymore because I touched the boy, things like that. And it's things that were so normal. Someone that, doesn't grow up in church, like if you held a guy's hand, like good for you. Like, you know what I mean? Like it's the first time you've held a guy's hand. Yay. But for me, it was like, no, you're going to hell because you held his hand. And yeah, no one likes you anymore. God hates you. So it was just so hard for me to, shake myself out of that feeling. And I remember when I finally left, like escaped really when I was 19, I still like held on to these rules that I had to follow. It took me a long time to even put on a pair of jeans. I was still wearing skirts, basically down to the floor for a while. And then it was like one day I was like, oh, let me put on green eyeshadow and see what happens. Am I gonna get burned to death? Like is God gonna strike me dead? And it didn't happen. And it was just like just little like small rebellions, and things that to the outside world were absolutely harmless and encouraged, like discovering yourself, discovering who you are, like what music you like to listen to, what's your style, all of those things that I never really had the opportunity to do in my youth, and I had to do them in my early 20s, which was a growing pain like no other that I would never wish on anyone, not even my worst enemy. And it was so hard to understand like how to navigate in the world and how to understand like how I was moving in the world and thinking about like, is this a good behavior? Is this a bad behavior? And what will happen to me if I continue this? And like, I think that it's just indoctrinated and it's really hard to um, get that out of our brains, I think, as people who have been raised very, very Christian. But I think like the titles of the book, Ugly Music and Good Monster, they're these two like incongruous things that are coming together. Um, and I feel like that's kind of been my life. It's been this first part of my life was like this beautiful, perfect, holy, wonderful, whatever, and then the other part has been kind of messy. But also beautiful in its own right as well. So I feel like my life has just been a meeting of those two, and I'm hoping for like a place in the middle that doesn't feel so messy and chaotic, but also leaves room for me to breathe, for me to be a whole, person, as opposed to just conforming to something, that a pastor might want or what the Bible says. And, I think you were talking about how like um, the language of the Bible and, that coming to play. And I noticed that immediately in a lot of your poems too. And that's how I was like, I know this girl. Like we have so much in common. And I was curious kind of like about how like you feel you're able to subvert or change or challenge uh, religious imagery. And what do you feel like when you do that, like you're gaining for yourself, whether in a poetic sense or even just personally? I guess I'm curious about that journey for you, what that has felt like.
Yeah, that's really interesting. First, thank you for sharing all of that. That's such a wild and intense way to grow up. And I can't imagine going to a school like that. I felt like school was like the one place where I could kind of have my secret self. Like I had my secret boyfriend and could wear my secret clothes. And I just like to not have that kind of outlet to me feels so oppressive. Um, and which then makes me wonder about like how the hell did you write your first book? Like coming out of that. But anyways, you asked the question first. So I think about this a lot about, the religious lexicon and kind of the myths and stories we're working with having such a deep understanding of the Bible. I feel like Bible stories are the stories that I know better than any other stories. And I used to feel a lot of shame about that. I think when I first started out as a poet, even now, like Greek mythology, Roman mythology, like any other mythologies, like I constantly am having to find myself Googling, like, who the fuck was Persephone again? And I'm like, every poet has a Persephone poem, every poet has an Orpheus poem, but I'm sitting over here like 40 years old, like wondering, like, what did she do? Why is the pomegranate appearing? It's like, and I get so confused. I think because it's not as like deeply ingrained, partly because when I did learn about those things, I still felt like, oh, I'm not supposed to be learning about other gods. Like there was a part of my brain that was sort of rejecting this. But then I started to realize, oh, not everyone gets the religious allusions I'm making. Like, I'll drop in a biblical character or, something like a line that alludes to the Bible, and then the editors are often like, "What the fuck is this?" And I'm like, "Oh, you haven't read this story about the bleeding woman or whatever."
You know about King Solomon? Wait a minute.
Right, exactly.
Let me tell you a story about babies.
Yeah. Yes. Like I have a poem in here where at the end of it refers to like Nebuchadnezzar and like the three guys, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, that.
Abednego in the fire. Yeah.
In the fire.
I knew that.
And you knew that. And then there's a fourth person, and then the poem ends that way. And I had somebody be like, why is there a fourth person? What is happening with the fire? What's going on here? Like suddenly there are these three men. And I was like, I'm making an illusion. This is like a thing poets do. Like if this was about any other, mythology, people would get. And I feel like we're losing that language as a culture, maybe. I feel like in older poems, you'll see more biblical allusions. I don't know if that's a good thing or if it has any value at all, but it's just what it is. I think a lot of contemporary poets have a stronger handling of other kinds of languages, but I find that it's hard to escape. And I think when I was writing Bianca, I was trying hard to run away from it a little bit more, but it was still kind of coming after me. And I find myself constantly having to edit that out. But I want to throw the same question back at you, but it appears that we're moving on.
We do have several questions from our guests who are here. So one of them is I can't talk tonight. I am so sorry. One of them is related to this discussion about spirituality and form, actually. And they are curious about the consciousness of this in your work, and if you experience form as confining or if it can be harnessed as a tool for liberation or reclamation. And it's for both of you. So whoever wants to answer first.
Yeah, I think when I first came to poetry, I felt a type of way about form. I guess I'll say that. I was like, I rejected it completely. I was like, no, it's not for me. Like that's, for the poetry that I'm reading in my literature classes and, whatever, that's not for me. Free verse all the way. Like that would have been on my t-shirt, free verse, bitch. And I didn't realize like the magic that is possible when you write in form. And like even just the sad girl sonnets, to me, like what was most important about the sonnet form was 14 lines and there's a volta in there. And that was it. Like I didn't have to worry about the meter or the rhyme scheme, but what I was focusing on was, okay, I have this many, this much space to get my point across. And somewhere in there needs to be a shift. Something has to happen, some tension. And that kind of kept me in check, allowed me to get to a place where I had a destination in mind. I'm like, okay, well, I need to get to this place at some point in this 14-line poem. And that to me, I find is really freeing because it gives me it gives me a goal. And I think that when you give yourself that goal, that's what's freeing about it. If someone is imposing that goal or that form upon you, I think that's a different story. You know, like if you don't want to write pantoums, then don't write pantoums. Like try something else. And I've just discovered the forms that feel um, most like me. And I think sonnets have been one of those things. And Oliver de la Paz and I, we talk a lot about sonnets together. Um, and he has a book, Diaspora Sonnets, which you should most definitely read. But there's just something about reclaiming the sonnet form, especially being a person of color, reclaiming that form that I feel like in some ways has shut us out. And thinking about too about like Terrence Hayes, his American Sonnets. And yeah, I feel like form can be really freeing if you allow yourself, especially like to find the one that feels like most in line with the way you speak. Yeah. How about you, Eugenia? What are your thoughts on form?
Yeah, I agree. I agree that form can be really freeing. Sometimes having a constraint, like maybe it's because we literally had constraints in our lives that we broke free of. It's sort of like that impulse appears again when we're writing poems and we're like, now I have a constraint and I get to break free. And, I don't know if maybe that plays a little bit into it. But I do agree that a lot of the work is finding the right container, the right movement, the right shape for the piece. And in Bianca, I have 3 poems that have complex PTSD in the title and 3 poems that have bipolar 2 disorder in the title. And for the bipolar ones, I wanted each one to be a different form. To kind of be able to contain the messiness of mental illness. And I tried a lot of different forms, but I think sometimes there's something about the forms that have a lot of repetition that I feel very like physically allergic to, where it reminds me of like church songs or hymns or kind of like the repetition, like the repetitive aspect of growing up in like a really intense Christian environment, like the memorizing and then the repeating. I think is something that I just feel like when I write in those kind of like villanelles or pantoums or hustle, well, not the hustle necessarily, but more like the with ones with repetitive lines, I feel very like my language regresses a bit and that I'm not able to transcend it and turn it into a poem that I can appreciate or that I feel like I can turn into something more. So for the bipolar poems that I have, the first one is a nonce poem that uses some of the text from the DSM-5 definition of bipolar 2 disorder. And then the last one that I wrote, but the second one in the book was the Zuihitsu. And I feel like finding this Japanese form that was not quite a poem, not quite an essay, but was defying chronology and has its roots in women kind of telling about their day-to-day and confessing about their very ordinary lives felt like the right space for the Bianca voice to come in and for me to finally be able to tell the story of what it was like to get diagnosed with this in my mid-30s. And then the last one was an ode. And I'd never written an ode. And I was like, I'm not a happy poet. And I didn't know how to write an ode, but it was literally, I was in a workshop that Tracy Brimhall was teaching. And she was like, the assignment was literally write an ode. And she said, write an ode to a body part. And she had this great history of the ode and gave us, some markers to meet, with like the exuberance that appears in the middle of an ode. And I was like, okay, I'm going to write an ode to my brain. And it was a great challenge for me because I was thinking, I write all these sad poems about mental illness and all of the ways that, trauma fucks us up. Like, why not celebrate their brain? And that was kind of the first time I really thought about that. And there's this great interview that Araceli Scarmay does when she was talking about writing the Black Maria. And she said that she did this thing where she cataloged every single verb in the book and wrote them all out. And she said, because if I notice that there are too many suffering verbs as I'm talking about, Black people, and as I'm talking about these experiences, that's a problem. And I need to be interrogating, like, what are the characters doing? What are the actions that are happening? I thought that was so interesting. As a side note, as I was thinking about, like, what does it mean to celebrate something that you don't always, that our brains kind of, that we've been told by our society that this doesn't deserve celebration, right? This is something that is that we talk about in terms of pain more than celebration, and like, how do we break out of that? How do we challenge ourselves? And so I feel like form can be a good way of helping us to move in a direction that we have not yet moved before.
Awesome. We have about 15 minutes left, and we have 3 more questions from our listeners, and then we would love for you to end with a poem each, if you think we can fit all of that in. How do you feel about that? Yeah. Okay, so we'll go on to the next. This question is, do you both have beta readers for your work, and how kind or harsh do you want them to be?
Beta readers. I love that. I love that. No, not really. I mean, yes and no. I think like I have some friends that I might just send a poem to be like, hey, I wrote something. That's it. You don't need to say anything. Just I wrote a thing. Especially now since I'm not in an MFA program and, removed from that quite a bit. I teach MFA students. So it's like the tables have turned. And I'm giving feedback as opposed to really getting feedback, which is interesting. And definitely different experience in writing my 2 books, where Ugly Music was during the MFA experience with advisors and other faculty, and then Good Monster was kind of written sometime after, where I didn't really have the kind of curated writing community that I had before. So I feel like, yeah, I try to show folks my work that I think are just going to kind of like keep me accountable and be like, hey, cool, you wrote something. I love that you did that. Here's something that I wrote. And I'm not always looking for feedback, especially right now. I think I'm just focusing on the writing itself. And then once I'm like, hey, these poems could be in a book, I think that's when I'll want more constructive feedback. But my editors, both at Yes Yes and Copper Canyon, have been phenomenal and give me the best feedback. Even if it's just like, you don't need this word. I'm like, yes, you're so right. I do not need that word there. I do love prepositional like phrases and prepositions. It's bad. So they always tell me you don't need that. Take that out now. I'm like, okay. But it's, yeah, I think in the future, I would like something that's a bit more curated, especially as I'm hopefully embarking on starting to write prose, which saying that is a very scary thing to say, since I really won't know what I'm doing there. So yeah, how about you, Eugenia?
Are you working on a memoir or essays or
Maybe.
all the things? Yeah. I would totally read that.
I think, honestly, there we go. I know who my reader is now. It's going to
Yes.
be.
Oh my gosh, if you ever want me to look at anything, I'd be happy to look at it.
Yeah, like since our upbringings have been really similar,
Yeah.
I think that you would be a great candidate for that because you would be able to like understand. So
Yeah.
okay. All right.
Yeah, definitely hit me up. Yeah, I don't really have beta readers, although, and same, like my first book was written mostly, the first draft of it was through the MFA, so it had a lot of eyes on it. The second one, I was kind of in isolation, hunkered down, which is why I took that Tracy Brimhall workshop, because I was like, I need some eyes to let me know if I'm going in the right direction or if like I just need to scrap this whole thing. And that was really helpful. I also just have a lot of anxiety showing people my first drafts. Like even in a workshop setting, I have to revise a thing like 100 times before someone can see it. I think part of that is from the history of like writing in journals and only telling the truth, like the really unedited truth to myself. And so I think some of that anxiety still comes into play when I show people first drafts. I'm like, no, these are my actual thoughts. You can't see those. But like I have a poet friend where she and I were both like, oh, we don't have beta readers. Let's exchange work. So we tried to do this thing actually this past March, and it worked out okay. We exchanged some work and like gave each other prompts, but then at the same time we were like, we don't have to do that again for a long time, because it was really it was freeing because we were both very like permissive in a lot of ways, like, oh, you don't have to do it, like you're going through a hard time. But I don't know. I don't love like exchanging new work with people. I do the thing that you do sometimes where I'll drop a poem. Like I have some poets who write visual poems, and that's kind of the thing that I've been interested in lately is figuring out like how to turn this feeling into a graph. And so like I'll give that to them sometimes and be like, can you look at my weird graph poem? They're like, cool, you did it. You like turned it into a graph. And then I'm like, great, I don't need more feedback. But at some point, maybe I will need to figure out how to really work those.
Yeah, well, I'm your gal too, so yeah.
I love this. This is so amazing. We have another question. Someone would like to know, I lost it now. What is bringing you joy right now, however seemingly small or silly or serious?
I think what's bringing me joy right now is like really simple things like preparing a nice meal for myself. Like today, I've had two really lovely meals. Like I made myself a peach caprese salad. So I had like slices of peach with slices of tomato and fresh mozzarella and fresh basil, and I made that for lunch. And then there's a little shop across the way in Kittery, Maine that make fresh pasta, and they also make like fresh sauces as well. So I just kind of stocked up on some like raviolis and sauces. So I had this like 3 cheese and roasted garlic ravioli in like a bolognese sauce, which was
Yum.
amazing. So I made that right before I hopped on here. So I feel like today, like the thing that's been bringing me joy is just like tasting yummy, like delicious things that are not processed, that um I know the people who work at the pasta shop, and so it's interesting to like be able to connect a face with the food that you're eating. So I've been enjoying that really simple pleasure of feeding myself really good food. Yeah.
Oh, I love that. Um, that's amazing. As somebody who does not cook well, like that answer to me is like, wow, that sounds heavenly. Um, I guess the thing bringing me joy lately is only sort of related, which is that I mentioned Top Chef before because I'm currently going through the last season of it because I have a TV, but I don't have TV. I just have a bunch of subscriptions to things. But my brother-in-law works for Comcast, and so he like logged into something, and so suddenly we have access to the latest season of Top Chef, and I'd seen all the other ones. But Kristen Kish is the one who, I don't know if you guys watch Top Chef. She hosts this new version. She's a Korean adoptee and has like a very like androgynous look. And I love looking at her outfits that they put her in
I know who
for
that
each
is.
of these episodes. They're like fantastic because it used to be Padma Lakshmi and she'd come wearing these like gorgeous gowns and like these beautiful like very femme outfits. And so to see what the stylists are doing with Kristen Kish has been phenomenal, and I really enjoy. I look at the food, but I also like just love looking at her outfits and like she's got like great earrings and this is the Leo side that's just like really, I'm like things that are shiny on a person. Like I love it. So that's actually something that's been giving me a lot of joy. Actually, I told my husband, I was like, this ends at 9. Can we watch an episode before we go to bed? So
Yeah, I know who this is. Yes, I like her.
yeah, the tattoos. I'm like, she's
Like I
great.
like her, like her.
Yeah, I know, right?
You're getting validation in the chat with Kish is awesome. So everybody is relating. We are down to 5 minutes. So I think it's probably best if we wrap up with maybe a poem from each of you. We try really hard to end on time because we know everybody's really busy. So
I think maybe I'll just read I Buy My Monster Roses. It's super short. It's also a sonnet. So I did actually, before I read, I want to say one quick thing about it. The inspiration behind this poem was in 2022, I did a residency in Portland, Oregon, and it was for the month of April. And during that time was also the 10th anniversary of my grandmother's passing, April 25th. And I knew I was going to be at a residency, by myself for most of the time. And I wanted something to on that morning to wake up to that reminded me of her. And her name was Rosa, which is rose in Spanish. So I went to the internet and asked them if they would help me purchase the most beautiful bouquet of roses. I wanted to buy them from this like super like hippy dippy, like posh, like hipster type place. All of those words don't even go together, but still, you know what I mean? You can picture that bouquet. And the internet provided, and my Venmo was waiting a good little chunk of change, and I bought the most beautiful bouquet of roses. So this is about that, but also in a way, those roses were for my monster as well. I buy my monster roses, though the people on the internet help too. They send money by pressing a small button on their screens. It would be disingenuous to claim all the credit. We can't heal or hurt alone. I sniff the top of each rose like a newborn scalp, fresh skin and hair only a few days picked. I try to arrange the flowers on my bed, create a romantic scene like all the 90s rom-coms I still watch. I'm stuck in the past. I know. I'm stuck in the present. I know that too. I thought the roses could be a cure, and maybe in a small way they were. Each petal I plucked so gently from the stems gave in to me.
I love hearing that story. That's a beautiful story.
Yeah.
I'm actually going to end with a poem from my first book because I was thinking about it in terms of our conversation. Every year, instead of doing New Year's resolutions, I give my year a word, and it's weird how the year starts to shape itself around this word. And this particular year, I called it the year of birthing. And then I was 26, and my best friend got pregnant, and she was like, "It's your word, it's your fucking word. That's why I got pregnant." And I was like, "No, that's not why you got pregnant." But I was thinking of this poem because in it, friends appear, like kind of overcoming their trauma. And I was just thinking a lot about like, as I was reading your books and thinking about this conversation, that like you feel to me like one of these people, like the friends who appear doing that. Like you feel so familiar. Even as you were talking about 90s rom-com in the poem, I was like, oh yeah, there was a line in another poem about Roswell. I'm watching Roswell.
Currently rewatching.
Yes. Oh, it's good. It's so good. Max. Okay, I'll read the poem. We called it the year of birthing. God handed me a trash bag bloated with feathers. Turn this into a bird, he said. He threw me a bowl of nails and make with this a new father. God gave some people whole birds, ready-made fathers with no loose bolts. The rest of us received crude nests, used mothers. I banged the nails into 2 planks of wood and marched around a church screaming, "Father, Father," until friends appeared, hammering the scraps they were given to make something of themselves. When beaten hard enough, some people scamper into corners sorted with similar beaten people. Others of us, the stubborn, unbreakable humans, weld our wounds to form tools. Then we spend our days mending bent humans or wiping the humans mired by all the wrong fingerprints. The morning the first baby was born in our circle of friends, we hovered over this child who, unlike us, was born whole. You were given a good mother, we said, a good father. Each one of us prayed. We scrubbed our soiled hands before we held his swaddled body.
Thank you so much. And it's 9 o'clock, and I am just so grateful. I want to thank you for your time and for your conversation, your poems. And I would like it if folks could unmute and maybe we could get a round of applause for our guests.
And thank you, Lisa and Becca, for inviting us and for hosting this and
Thank you.
giving us space to do this. Thank you so much.
It was our pleasure.
Thank you for hosting our first date.
Yeah.
This brings me so much joy.
Yeah, it'll be a real one in person soon. Yeah.
Yes, please.
Well, we wanted to just say that if you enjoyed this event, please follow the Notebooks Collective on our social media accounts and sign up for our newsletter. And we have more events coming down the pike soon. And with that, we thank you so much for coming. And we thank Eugenia and Diannely, and we hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Ciao.